Everyone joining us today. Thanks very much for popping in for this Society of Conservation Biology webinar series. We've just got a couple of minutes while a few additional people can join us. Looks like we've got a lot of people on mute, which is fantastic. Just a reminder to keep that throughout if you don't mind until we get to questions. It looks like we might have quite a nice intimate group, in which case we can probably all have a bit more of a conversation afterwards. But while people have a bit of a chance to join us, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Emma McIntosh. I'm a member of the Conservation Science and Policy Journal editorial board. And I'm joined by Martin, who's been organising this series and is organising the series for the rest of the year, as well as our speaker today, Tracy Lee. So Tracy, who's very generously offered to share her research today, is a senior program manager and has been so for over 20 years with the Mastaki Institute as a research institute affiliated with the Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta in Canada, which we'll hear a lot more about, the region and the institute's connections there. Tracy acquired her BSc from the University of Victoria in Biology and Environmental Design, and her MSc from the University of Calgary in Resources and the Environment Program in 2010. As a senior project manager, Tracy works on research initiatives including road ecology, wildlife coexistence, landscape ecology, citizen science, and conservation planning and policy. I think we'll probably see all of those dimensions of her research demonstrated in this particular publication and summary today. For those of you who've just joined, just a reminder about keeping yourself on mute if you can throughout the presentation to reduce background noise. I'm going to be recording the presentation, but not the subsequent discussion. So just so you're aware, that recording is currently underway. I think without further ado, I'll hand over to Tracy, but just to say that Tracy will be speaking for about 35 minutes, leaving us with about 20 minutes for discussion and questions afterwards. So enjoy and take it away, Tracy.
Thank you so much, Emma. I'm really very honored actually to be here today to share with you our recent publication prioritizing human safety and multi-species connectivity across a regional road network that was published in Conservation Science and Practice. You've all had an introduction to me, but I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors, which are listed on this first slide. And in particular, the two individuals that helped me conceptualize this project and were involved throughout the entire project are Dr. Tyler Creech from the Center for Large Landscape Conservation in Montana, and Dr. Adam Ford, who's with the University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus. So what is the conservation challenge that we're talking about today? Our project really focuses on or tries to address the intersection of roads and wildlife. And I absolutely love this quote by Ben Goldfarb. He's a writer that writes quite a bit on, in the past, beavers and now on road ecology issues, and he's just a fantastic writer. Collisions may be road ecology's most obvious concern, but fragmentation is roadkill's pernicious twin. So I think that's our word of the day, brought to you by Ben Goldfarb, pernicious, meaning that it has a harmful effect. And so indeed, I think most of you, when you think of roads and wildlife, you think of animal vehicle collisions, which is a motorist safety concern. And for some species, it can actually be detrimental from a population perspective if they're a small population and they're losing a lot on the roads. But perhaps even more concerning is the effect of fragmentation. So the road network and the ability of animals to move around the landscape, and actually because of roads with high traffic volume, avoiding movement across that road and essentially cutting them off from important habitat and mates, etc. So we do know that there are solutions to this problem. So we have a conservation challenge, and one of the solutions has been heavily researched is out of Banff National Park, and now you see these things globally. This is a diagram that was made to help communicate the impact or to communicate the issue in Banff. And so you can see that we have a series of tunnels and underpasses with fencing that are connected by fencing. And the idea here is you remove the animals from the road surface, reducing obviously then motorist safety, but you still facilitate movement across to the other habitat with these bridges or underpasses. Now this is, you know, we have a problem that we've just outlined and we have a solution. So why aren't we just moving forward? Well, obviously investment in this type of infrastructure is very expensive, and the need across our road network is very great. And so we need to be able to prioritize the landscape to know where we should be making these types of investments. The study area that I'm going to talk about today is in Canada. It's in the province of Alberta, and we're going to focus on southern Alberta. And this is the planning region within the province. So we share a border with the British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and Montana in the United States. And just before I talk a little bit more about this study area, I just want to draw your attention to this little red circle area down here. This is the Canadian Rocky Mountains, and this is Banff National Park up here. And there's these two low east-west movement areas through the Rocky Mountains in Banff and down here in Highway 3. And I've probably spent the better part of the last 15 years working with colleagues on trying to understand how we move animals across this low elevation transportation corridor. So we have the full complement of Canadian large mammals. We have elk and moose and bighorn sheep and both deer species, grizzly bear, wolf, cougar that are crossing this road. And indeed, this road has been seen as a demographic barrier to female grizzly bear movement. So females are no longer crossing this road. So we have spent, you know, all this time talking to transportation about the need to mitigate for a system in this area. We came up with 9 different sites that we felt they should create a mitigation system that would facilitate the safe passage of wildlife and reduce animal vehicle collisions. But when you talk to the transportation agency, they're responsible for the road network and making decisions at the scale of the province. So the province has 31,000 kilometers of roads. This represents less than 1%. So when you approach them with a conservation challenge and a solution, but you're talking about less than 1% of what they're responsible for making decisions on, there's a disconnect. And so probably a lot of you relate to this. They actually need to understand from a more regional perspective where they should be prioritizing for mitigation. And if this is indeed a really important area, then it should come out in this regional assessment. So the project I'm talking about today focuses on this whole southern region. It's a heavily utilized area. This is the city of Calgary. These little gray blobs are urban centers. Calgary is a city of over 1 million people, and it's where I live. This is our Trans-Canada Highway coming through Banff, through Calgary, all the way down to Medicine Hat and into Saskatchewan. So this is a very highly trafficked road that goes across the whole country. And we go from our Canadian Rocky Mountains into kind of grassland, into kind of foothills area and then grassland. So there's a transition from kind of trees to grassland over on the eastern side of the study area. And there's a lot of agriculture, oil and gas activity. It's a pretty fragmented and heavily used landscape. So the objectives of our project were to engage multi-departmental agencies. So we're interested in both the transportation department, which is responsible for motorist safety, and we are interested in the environmental or the fish and game department that's responsible for healthy wildlife populations. And so we wanted to understand this issue, not just from an animal vehicle collision motorist safety issue, but also from an ecological connectivity issue. We wanted to identify road sections with high ecological connectivity value. We wanted to identify road sections with a high risk of animal vehicle collisions or motorist safety risk. And we wanted to identify if and where these two conditions intersect. And then we wanted to be able to, again, prioritize the road sections for mitigation. So our conservation problem solving resulted in kind of 6 steps. I've talked about the stakeholder engagement. We then went and asked those stakeholders to identify metrics that they felt would adequately represent the motorist safety and the ecological connectivity issue in the region. We then developed models and indices to represent those metrics, road indices. We then compared the road indices relationships to each other, and tried to figure out where they align. Where do these different metrics align on the landscape? And then we developed mitigation prioritization indices to help the transportation department prioritize mitigation. And then we have some recommendations around policy and planning that we think came out of this project. So I'm going to go through each of these steps. I've kind of combined step 1 through 3 because I think I've talked a lot about the stakeholder engagement. But then we're going to talk through which metrics we identified and how we built the metrics and indices for this project. So the metrics were broken down into motorist safety risk, and we used the Royal Canadian Mounted Police data set for animal vehicle collisions. And so this is collision data. If you are involved in an accident on the rural landscape, the RCMP are sometimes called. They will then GPS and document that it's an animal vehicle collision. If you're involved in an accident that the police don't need to attend, if there's over $2,000 worth of damage, you need to report that. You need to have a police report for insurance. So this data set is fairly limited. If you hit an animal and you don't have damage to your car, that is not recorded. So this is strictly collision data that's reported to our provincial or our federal police system. And then we adjusted the RCMP, the exact same data set for traffic volume, as if traffic volume was normalized across the study area, because we wanted to understand where is the highest risk to an individual motorist that's driving a section of road. So the first one really addresses kind of where there's the highest collisions, and the second one addresses where there's the biggest risk to an individual driver. We then came up with 5 different connectivity models that we thought would represent the ecological concerns for the region. We did develop a structural connectivity model, which is species agnostic. It's based on naturalness remaining on the landscape, because I think you recall I told you this is a pretty heavily utilized landscape. There's a lot of alteration. Just to give you an example, in the grasslands natural region, which makes up the predominant natural region for our study area, it's 50% altered or modified by human activity. 58%, so there's less than 50% remaining in its natural state. We did a grizzly bear connectivity model. This is a species at risk in our province that occurs on the western portion of the study area and is quite sensitive to the road fragmentation issue. Pronghorn connectivity. Pronghorn are an antelope species that migrate between Montana, Saskatchewan, and Alberta in the spring and the fall. And they're a beautiful species that's very popular, huntable species. And again, we're quite concerned about road fragmentation, so the behavior of them not crossing the road when the traffic volumes get too high. Rattlesnakes are another species at risk in Alberta, and the road mortality is a major cause of, a major concern for the population of rattlesnakes in mostly the eastern portion of our study area. And then we looked at mule deer connectivity, and mule deer are a species that occur throughout the entire range, and they really drive the animal vehicle collision data. So we chose to look at mule deer. And then all these metrics were developed into road indices. So the road indices for the motorist safety, by that we mean that we took the RCMP data and we applied it. We divided the road into kilometer segments. This was actually based on the transportation agencies, how they plan. So it's using their kilometer markers. And we looked at the number of AVCs within a kilometer. And then again, I mentioned that we adjusted that as if it was a normalized traffic volume. And so that's what these look like. So this is, I'm going to draw your attention oddly to the one on the right first. So this is just the RCMP based AVC index. And you can see as we're going from yellow to red would be an increasing AVC risk. And you can kind of see there's this triangle between the major urban centers. And these are indeed our busiest highways that support and that where we see a lot of animal vehicle collisions. And also we see a lot of them occurring around these urban centers where we have a lot of deer and high traffic volumes. If you adjust for traffic volume as if it was a same traffic volume across, this is kind of giving us an idea of where do you actually have the highest risk of hitting something as a motorist. And you can see that then we pop out these areas more on the rural landscape. You can see these actually look quite different. So depending on what you're trying to answer from a motorist safety risk, these might give you kind of different ways to look at the data. The traditional way is this highest collisions. That's the traditional way we tend to look at AVC data. So then, if you recall, we had a number of those metrics for ecological connectivity. And we used a CircuitScape, which is an open source platform that kind of is based on circuit theory. And it requires the development of 2 layers. It requires you to have a resistant surface to represent animal movement. So how permeable is the landscape for an animal to be able to move across it? And so you end up with a grid that has a score for each kind of grid cell to tell you how easy it is for the animal that you're interested in to move through that area. And then it also requires a focal node layer, which represents where we are connecting to and from. And there's many different ways you can come up with your focal node layer, and it has quite an influence on your results. So you're going to hear me talk about a mesh approach, and so I'm just going to show you what I mean by that when I talk about each of the connectivity models. So this is our study area, and this is our provincial road network that we're interested in understanding its impacts. And these yellow polygons represent areas in the network that are over 500 kilometers squared in size, so relatively healthy areas without the provincial highway system. And then we took just a centroid of those. So you can see these little centroids. So in our connectivity modeling, we're asking the model to run from each of these points to each of the other points to see how they move around the landscape and across the road surface. So these are the different species and the how we developed these, and I'm just very quickly going to go through this. We tried to make use of other people's models when they were available. So remember, and part of the stakeholder engagement was working with other academics that have come up or developed connectivity models. So you'll see some of that here. So for the structural connectivity model, we used a land cover layer that's been produced by one of our Alberta's Biodiversity Monitoring Institute. And we assigned resistance values to that using the Theobald et al. Paper for values on land covers based on naturalness. So we applied that to our landscape. And we used that mesh node approach that I just showed you on the previous slide. For prairie rattlesnake, we used an inverted habitat suitability index model that was developed based on hibernacula and species reports from the provincial government. And again, we used the same mesh node approach, but we restricted it to the rattlesnake range, so where they actually occur in the province. For grizzly bear, we were able to get an RSF model that was developed by Dr. Scott Nielsen from U of A for 3 different seasons for grizzly bears. And we took the average of those and inverted them, the resource selection function, to create a resistance value. And instead of using the mesh nodes, because grizzly bears are really restricted to the western range of our study area, we actually identified habitat security patches, so areas that are greater than 5 kilometers squared that have really low human activity that we think female grizzly bears would be happy in. And so we came up with that approach, and we had 183 different nodes that were represented in that. For mule deer, we derived a habitat model and inverted it, and this was based on winter ungulate aerial survey data. And again, we used our same mesh nodes that I introduced earlier. And then for pronghorn, we were very lucky to get a connectivity model using the CircuitScape linkage matchbar approach that we used for the rest of our models from Dr. Andrew Jakes from his PhD research, and it included both spring and fall. We took the average of that, and he used 1,000 random points. So it's fun to talk to connectivity people about how we have used different ways that the nodes are represented, and that does have an impact on your results. And so it would be fun if people have thoughts on that to share. So all of these then were flipped into road indices, where again, we used that same kilometer grid that we used for the motorist safety risk indexes, and we took the mean connectivity value that occurs within that 1 kilometer road grid or section, sorry, to give us a value that looks similar to the AVCs that gives us an index. So that's what this looks like. This is the pronghorn connectivity model over here. This is showing the top 50%. And as we go from blue to yellow, we get increasing connectivity value. So you can see there's a lot of places in yellow and orange that are important for movement across the road. When you create that into a connectivity index all along the road network, we can see here that now where we have red represents the highest connectivity value road sections in our road network. So now we have all these indices that are represented as road indices from 0 to 1, where 1 represents a higher value. So now we want to compare those indices to understand how they relate to one another. And so I'm just going to show you 2, because we did do a lot of comparisons, but I'm just going to show you 2 today. So we compared that RCMP-based animal vehicle collision index with the traffic adjusted. So the same data set, but one is traffic adjusted. And then we also compared the RCMP-based animal vehicle collision with the structural connectivity index to show where ecological connectivity and motorist safety kind of align. So we converted this, the indices into percentiles, and we ran linear regressions to show the relationship. And then we summed the indexes together to help identify spatially where there's alignment. So if you sum two indexes that add to 1 together, you get 2. So the closer to 2 you are, the more kind of alignment there is. So that's what these results look like here. And so we found that road sections with the highest total AVCs, which is this map here, per motor exhibit only moderate spatial overlap with the traffic adjusted. And now you can kind of see that visually. And then this histogram here shows you, remember we added the two indexes together. And so the closer to 2 here shows you where there's good kind of alignment. And then we represented that spatially here. So if you're a transportation agency and you want to say we're dealing with where we have the highest number of collisions and where we have the greatest risk to individual motorist safety, then you would prioritize these areas in red, which actually really helps you fine tune when you just look at the highest collisions, which are quite occurring across the landscape. So we did the same thing, as I mentioned, with again, the same RCMP data set, but then we compared it to our structural connectivity index. And we found that there's really poor spatial overlap between the two. And I think this is a really important finding because this tells us if we continue to plan for transportation, for mitigation with transportation agencies just using the highest areas for animal vehicle collisions, which is predominantly driven by deer, then we might be missing out on connectivity or reducing the impacts of fragmentation. So again, we add these two together, and where we have that in the histogram, these areas closer to 2 is where we have the areas in red on this map, showing you where there's kind of alignment. So now in this map, you're saying, well, we're concerned about human safety, motorist safety, but we're also concerned about structural connectivity, the remaining naturalness on the landscape where we think animals are most likely to cross is our assumption there. And so where is that occurring on the landscape? And you can see that here in these red areas. Okay, so that now we know, okay, there's not good alignment. So how do we actually go about prioritizing the road sections for mitigation? And so, excuse this very busy looking graph, but remember we had the 2 questions, human safety and wildlife connectivity or ecological connectivity. We had these different data and models that we generated. Then we generated all these indices. And then we simply created a process where we came up with a mitigation priority index. So mitigation priority index _C just evenly weights all of the connectivity models to give you a product. MPI, mitigation priority index animal vehicle collision just weights the motorist safety indexes. And then you can see we went through a process of weighting them 50% to AVC and 50% connectivity. So it allows the transportation planners and the environmental agencies to control and to change depending on the highway they're interested in looking at or the concerns that they have expressed. And so this is just the wildlife connectivity, just to give you an example. It's kind of hard to look at this map, but the areas in red are showing you where from a wildlife connectivity you would want to focus your efforts. Now, what's really interesting is this was a really stakeholder-driven process. You remember we had a lot of people that came up with the metrics and people that contributed to the modeling process. So we presented all this information back to our stakeholder group, and then we walked them through an analytical hierarchy process, or an AHP, which enables them to make pairwise comparisons and come up with weights for how you as a group have weighed these considerations. And so, for example, together we said, okay, your goal here is to prioritize road sections for both human safety and wildlife movement. What's more important, human safety concerns or ecological concerns? And you can see here they said human safety concerns, and we said how much more important. And so the analytical hierarchy process makes these pairwise comparisons and then gives you as the researcher these percentages to put into your model. So I was actually quite dismayed that people voted human safety so much higher than ecological concerns, because there was a lot of biologists in the room. And I felt like they weren't pulling the conservation card. Anyway, this probably does reflect reality, and it does reflect how we make decisions normally on road mitigation. He takes it down to even the next level, and he compares, structural connectivity to mule deer, and they compared structural connectivity to pronghorn. It does all these pairwise comparisons, and it gives you the percentage down here. So you can see our group in this analytical hierarchy process rated the structural connectivity quite high over the functional species connectivity models. And I believe it's because it's quite a heavily used landscape, and people felt that the naturalness or the remaining habitat left on the landscape maybe represented quite well the ecological connectivity in our region. So that's what these results look like here. If you take the AHP results, you can see they look quite differently, and where you get these red pop-outs. And we were kind of calling these like mitigation neighborhoods that you would go and consider how a mitigation system should be implemented. So the tool allowed for flexibility and dialogue and discussion around what are we prioritizing and why, and what do we need to include and why. So we do have some recommendations that came out of this process from a policy and planning implementation perspective. And so our kind of big lessons learned throughout this process and our discussions is that road mitigation for wildlife is effective but costly. And the needs are really widespread, as you can see from some of our modeling. And therefore, prioritization is a really important tool. So I think it's really important as well for the agencies to show the public that there's been some type of systematic process to understand at a regional level where the dollars should be invested for meeting both mandates of transportation and environment. Traditional approaches for planning for road mitigation tend to focus on road sections with the highest animal vehicle collisions. And we believe that this may miss opportunities to address the impact of fragmentation from roads, especially on species that you're concerned about, like rattlesnake, grizzly bear, where we know that roads are having a detrimental impact on these populations, and there's species at risk that we want to try and address those impacts. So our recommendations are that we believe most transportation planning needs to evolve to include wildlife connectivity considerations. We believe that that is the responsibility of the Environment or the Fish and Wildlife Agency to help the transportation departments understand where connectivity is important and which species they're concerned about. And therefore, we need improved relationships between transportation and environmental agencies. We are seeing this happening in numerous areas. There's a number of states that actually have policy now that integrate those agency mandates. So transportation has to look at wildlife connectivity state plans, for example, and integrate those lessons into their plans for transportation and road mitigation. But I think there's, I don't know if anyone's on the call that can give me an example of states that have done that. We haven't done that in Canada yet. And then I was very dismayed that human safety got rated so much higher than, I shouldn't be surprised, I guess, than the ecological connectivity concerns. And so I do believe there's more education needed regarding investment in conservation strategies relating to roads, species conservation, and land use planning in general. And so I'm going to leave you with kind of this big challenge that I'd love to hear what people think about it. Often animal vehicle collisions are driven by deer. Not obviously other species get hit, but the numbers and the highest collisions tend to be driven by deer. But maintaining deer movement across a road and to address motorist safety can be achieved with culverts and fencing. Maintaining grizzly bear or pronghorn movement across a road requires mitigation infrastructure of an entirely different magnitude. So in other words, even if we have this prioritization tool and they go into an area that maybe says benefits deer and grizzly bear, they can solve the human safety issue much cheaper than they can solve the grizzly bear issue. The level of investment is very different. So grizzly bears prefer overpasses, usually ones that are kind of 50 meters wide. Pronghorn prefer overpasses. I think that in Wyoming, the overpasses were 20 meters wide. But this is a substantially different level of investment than a small culvert with fencing. So I think we really need to understand where the funding is coming from and what the barriers are to funding infrastructure for ecological connectivity, and figure out how we can help close this gap. Because transportation tends to make the decisions, but their mandate is motorist safety, not necessarily ecological connectivity. So I will leave it at that and just say thank you very much for listening today, and interested or hoping that people have some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tracy. It's really lovely to hear a bit more and bring the work and the species and people alive in your paper. And for anyone interested in finding out a bit more information, Tracy's research was published in Conservation Science and Practice in November last year, and it's available as an open access publication as well as the underlying data. So we're going to be moving on to some questions, opening the floor. The recording, I'll end that in just a second so that Martin might get there, so that